Christmas time is here, and that means cracker jokes, ugly Christmas jumpers, it being completely acceptable to get drunk before dinner time, and metaphorically shedding the blood of your fellow man on the internet because he or she thinks that 1988's Die Hard may or may not be a Christmas movie. So, in case you don't keep up with pointless internet disputes, since the late 2000s, a massive debate has arisen online between those who believe that Die Hard is in fact a sleeper Christmas movie and those who say no, it's just a film set during Christmas. This is a conflict that has really started to escalate in recent years, making the historic battle of is Evil Dead 2 a remake or a sequel pale in comparison. Now, I'm going to try and be as fair as possible here, but full disclosure, as a grown man with no children, Christmas really doesn't mean a whole lot to me.
Humbug.
I mean, I enjoy it for what it is, but my bar might be pretty low as to what I consider Christmassy, for lack of a better word. A lot of the time when I see people debate Die Hard's place as a Christmas classic, they will often make the point that if it were, then so too would Gremlins and Trading Places. And honestly, when I saw that for the first time, I was genuinely confused, because I grew up thinking that Gremlins was seen as a fully fledged Christmas classic by all, much more so than Die Hard would have been, so what do I know? Personally, I'm not sure I consider Die Hard to be the Christmas classic that some do, but I can certainly see where they're coming from. Now, before we get into the actual film, I'm going to have to spend some time on what I consider non-arguments. These are points I often see brought up that actually have very little to do with the film itself, but rather the people behind it and things they may have said, or the audience who enjoy it. If you spend any amount of time on the internet, you probably won't be surprised to hear that even conversations about what category a 30-year-old action movie fits into can quickly descend into people making assumptions about the personal life or even politics of those who disagree. But in reality, people from all walks of life and from all sides of the political spectrum fall into the yes, Die Hard is a Christmas movie camp. And if you don't believe me, just ask Liberal Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau what he thinks.
Yes?
Yes, Die Hard is absolutely a Christmas movie. There's no question
That is the
about
Prime
it.
Minister of Canada has just confirmed that.
Or Conservative news commentator Ben Shapiro.
What's your favorite Christmas movie?
Yeah.
Die Hard. And it's a Christmas movie. Come on.
It is a Christmas movie.
We all agree with
Christmas
that.
movie.
Yeah.
Anybody who argues it's not a Christmas movie is just an ignoramus. Doesn't understand basic New Testament theology.
That's right.
So let's run an experiment. Go on Twitter and type Die Hard is the best Christmas movie ever, and just send it out into the ether. After a while, before anyone even calls you out on it clearly not being the best Christmas movie ever, there's a good chance you will receive this response. Well, if Die Hard is a Christmas movie, then why was it released in the summer? There's a couple of reasons why this just shouldn't matter. The main one being release dates don't have the power to retroactively change the genre themes or narrative thread of a film. The screenplay for Die Hard was completed long before a bunch of studio execs sat around a table and decided what was the best, most profitable time to release the film, with the earliest draft of the screenplay available online being a revision dated November 2nd, 1987. If the release date had the power to determine genre and category, by this logic, Die Hard could exist as a Christmas movie on paper, but somehow lose its status once it was given a summer release date. And that's just not how storytelling works. Die Hard was released in the summer because it was the 80s and that's when action movies were the most profitable. It was what was best for business and nothing more. The irony here is that letting a commercial move by a corporation like 20th Century Fox determine what does and does not constitute as a Christmas movie is about the most un-Christmassy thing I've ever heard. And hey, all historical evidence points to Jesus actually being born in the summer. But while we're on the topic of release dates, I know I'm spending a long time on something I call the non-argument, but this is where we are. This would mean Miracle on 34th Street, among others, can't be considered Christmas movies either, as they too had summer release dates. One of those movies even gave us one of the most famous Christmas songs.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas.
Now, to this people may respond, oh, well that was before Christmas films were a thing. This is a good example of just randomly changing the goalposts, but it's also just not true. You may be shocked to hear this, but the tradition of Christmas stories even predates the advent of film, when a little-known British author named Charles Dickens Yeah, I never heard of him either, released A Christmas Carol in December of 1843 and began an annual tradition of releasing one of his famous Christmas stories from then on. This tradition would continue with the early cinematic adaptations of his work in what we would consider the Christmas release period. And that's just the different versions of the most famous Christmas story. But there's plenty more, like It's a Wonderful Life, which predates Miracle on 34th Street and yet had a Christmas release. So the tradition of releasing what are most certainly Christmas films was well established prior to the summer releases of Miracle on 34th Street and Company, meaning these are just exceptions to the rule. So it can easily be argued that so too was Die Hard. But let's actually discuss the film itself. From a story point, what makes a Christmas film? Well, the very first thing that needs to be checked off the list, naturally, is its setting. And obviously, Die Hard ticks this box, being set entirely during an office party on the eve of Christmas. But is that really enough? Surely the holiday has to play a crucial role, and not just be a backdrop. Some will say the setting of Die Hard can be switched out, and the events of the film not affected. Therefore, it's not a Christmas movie. But I'm not so sure that's the case. The entire impetus for John McClane to be at Nakatomi Plaza is because he's in town specifically to spend the holiday with his family. And sure, he could visit any time of the year, but it's made pretty clear from the very beginning of the film that John is a fan of Christmas by his request for the limo driver to play some real Christmas music and his comments about how weird it is to spend Christmas in LA. So it always seemed to me like John was putting a lot of stock into the whole magic of Christmas cliche to solve his marital problems, and while that probably isn't a good idea, it still tells us a lot about his character. So we're not just talking about switching out a setting here, we're switching out some of the earliest characteristics John displays to the audience. Also, one of the keys to Hans Gruber's plan is the fact that he knows the office will be understaffed, it being Christmas, yet still have enough hostages due to the Christmas party. I guess you could change the setting and find other reasons for the events to unfold the way they do, Thanksgiving or 4th of July weekend, but that seems even more convoluted. And really, the same could be said for plenty of other Christmas movies. Home Alone, for example. The McAllisters could easily be taking a family trip for 4th of July weekend, leave Kevin behind, and have similar events unfold. This is actually a pretty good comparison, as the only thing that really separates Home Alone and Die Hard is the kind of weaponry our heroes use to dispatch the thieves. Another point people will often make is that Bruce Willis has stated that it's not a Christmas movie. Now, first of all, this was a line from a comedy roast, or as it's also called, a joke, and the full line was,
Die Hard is not a Christmas movie. It's a goddamn Bruce Willis movie.
But if you want to take this as Bruce Willis stating a fact rather than a thing he said to cause amusement or laughter, then I'd like to point out that Willis also claimed to have improvised the iconic line,
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
when it in fact appears in early drafts of the script. A script written by a man who did in fact say yes, Die Hard is a Christmas movie. So, who are we to trust? Speaking of Die Hard writers, more than a decade before it was a film, it was a novel by Roderick Thorpe, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name. In the novel, a retired New York police detective visits the 40-story office headquarters of the Claxon Oil Corporation in Los Angeles during an office party, and ends up spending the night fighting off a group of German terrorists. Now, the film actually follows the book pretty damn closely. Even scenes like McClane crawling through elevator shafts with no shoes are taken right from the original story. There are some minor changes, of course. John McClane, or Joe Leland as he's called in the novel, is a much older retiree, actually having served in the war and having something of a history with the leader of the terrorist group, who goes by the name of Anton Gruber in the novel. Leland is also in town to visit his daughter and grandchildren rather than his wife, and the terrorist group have no ulterior motive here. Their goal is to expose secret documents to the public detailing the corporation's shady deals and military connections in Chile. More of the story is left intact. Leland, like McClane, is aided in his quest by communicating with an LAPD sergeant outside the building. Both characters drop a C4 explosive down an elevator shaft at one point in the story, and both end up jumping off an exploding rooftop with a fire hose attached to their waist before shooting through a window to regain entry. Both book and film even climax with our heroes getting the drop on the villain by taping a gun behind their back. This all sounds irrelevant, but what I'm getting at here is that the book and the film are very alike. And one of the biggest similarities is the night it's set. Christmas Eve. So we can talk all day about how the filmmakers could have switched out the setting for something else, but the fact is they didn't. The film had been in development since as early as 1983, and in these years the producers decided what to keep and throw away from the novel, keeping everything that they thought was important to the story, including its Christmas setting. Of course, the presence of the holiday doesn't end there. As well as the plot being driven by Christmas, the film contains plenty of references to the Yuletide season, from the set decoration and the accompanying music, which often plays at key moments, to dialogue referring to the holiday, and key scenes that rely entirely on seasonal elements being present. Tropes, motifs and themes we associate with Christmas stories are here too. John McClane begins the story as a weary traveller, a trope we see in many Christmas tales, including the original, and finishes it as the redeemed hero, much like Ebenezer Scrooge in the Dickens classic. There is also a Grinch in Hans Gruber, or more accurately a Mr. Potter, as Gruber learns nothing by the end of the story. Remember, one of the only major changes from the novel is that he is completely unrelatable here, making him a more fitting obstacle for our hero to overcome on Christmas Eve. One of the biggest focuses of the film is also one of the most recurrent themes we see in Christmas stories, the value of family. The core of the Die Hard story is about John McClane reconciling with his family. All the things that happen in between are just obstacles to his ultimate goal. Again, it and Home Alone aren't too dissimilar. The film even ends with Gruber's lost fortune falling from the sky as a stand-in for snow, something often used in film as a visual metaphor to represent a new beginning. Look, we could talk forever about all the little hints of Christmas throughout this film, the fact that John's wife is named Holly, that Franz Gruber was the name of the composer of Silent Night, or how about the visual similarities between John McClane crawling through air vents and elevator shafts, and Santa Claus coming down the chimney. Sure, the overall tone of Die Hard isn't the most festive, and there are certainly more suitable Christmas movies you could watch if you're trying to get into the spirit. But even some of those, while getting the tone right, fail in areas where Die Hard triumphs. I mean, the beloved classic A Christmas Story is in essence just a film about a child who desperately wants a gun. But to wrap things up, do I think Die Hard is a Christmas movie? Sure. Is it the best example of a Christmas movie? No, certainly not. But for millions of people, it isn't Christmas until they see Hans Gruber fall from Nakatomi Plaza. This may enrage some, but we don't have to share traditions. In Japan, KFC is a staple of Christmas dinner for millions who celebrate it, but it'd look pretty out of place on any table in the West come Christmas Day. This is entirely down to a marketing campaign in the 70s that proved to have unforeseen lasting power. And that's all Christmas is, a hodgepodge of different things we liked and decided to keep around. Some of our most enduring symbols of the holiday are rooted in advertising campaigns intended to sell us Coca-Cola, but ended up becoming traditions. If you don't like the idea of Die Hard becoming one, it's best to just get used to it now, cause the thing with traditions is they only grow stronger with age.